Right guys, we're back with the second part of the worst tier 10 tanks and tank lines within World of Tanks console, and we're going to have a look at them right now. Of course, last video in part 1 we looked at the top nations from the USA down to France. This video is going to be essentially looking at the Chinese all the way down to the mercenaries and potentially some of the premium tier 10 tanks, so that you have the best idea as to what tanks to kind of prioritize when you're grinding through the tech tree lines, and what grinding lines aren't going to be as bad when you're going through and just actually trying to get to that tier 10. So first things first, China. Let's have a look. Essentially, you have quite a few different Chinese tanks that you can actually go towards. It was a lot bigger now than it used to be in terms of what tanks are available. There are certain ones that I would definitely avoid within the game, and we're going to have a look at those. First ones first, I think, to be honest with you, I would kind of avoid the 113. I'd think that if you're going for a Chinese heavy, the WZ-111-5A is the tank to go to. Yes, you kind of get the same kind of speed, you kind of have the same still concealment essentially. You've kind of got the same gun, except you get an extra 50 alpha on the WZ-111-5A. Armor model on the 5A actually works out slightly better, to be honest with you. I find that you don't really bounce off the 113 an awful amount. Yes, you don't really bounce off the 5A that much either. But when you consider it as a tank that is kind of playing like a medium heavy, then yeah, they both really do play that kind of playstyle. But I just think overall the 5A is the one to go for. Of course, at tier 10, you do have the premium Chinese heavy that is more overpowered in the Quillin, which of course is a premium tank that you have to pay money for if you actually want to play, and that's just Wargaming's mentality. So yeah, I think the tech tree line going up to it is pretty awful. You reach the 110 and you're like, oh my god, this is terrible. Then you get to tier 9 and it's kind of like a IS-3 at tier 9. Tier 7, it's an IS-2, but which is the same as an IS essentially, but it's slightly worse. Type 58, fairly decent, you know, you can have good games, but it's a tier 6 and you're not at it for too long. I think in terms of prioritizing, definitely save your silver after upgrading or unlocking, and get the WZ-111-5A first over the 113. Yes, essentially, they're not much of a difference, but that's kind of the one I would go for. As far as the other tanks in the tech tree, you probably want to still avoid the Chinese tank destroyer. Yes, it got a little bit more alpha damage, but when it's trying to basically be an Object 268 version 4, you know, the heavily armoured one that we talked about in the last video, then it doesn't really compete that much. And when you could just play a 268 which has a better reload and more kind of trolly armor, this one just gets penned in the lower plate every time anyone aims at it, and kind of that superstructure, it does kind of work in the armor model, but for the most part you're probably not going to bounce very much, and because it's fairly flat, yes, it does have a little bit of an angle, but you'll get penned fairly reliably, and in those kind of side areas of the tank you can get penned pretty easily. Yeah, I just don't think that this tank is kind of where it's at in terms of the kind of armoured tank destroyers with 850 alpha. I think it's better than it was, but yeah, probably still not that overpowered or the best one that you want to be going towards. As far as the medium tank, the 121, it's probably the best of all of them from the tech tree. You know, it's competition between the 121 and the WZ-111-5A, I think, in terms of which one's the best. 121 has fairly strong armour, has a decent turret, not particularly super overpowered, but yeah, you might be able to bounce a few rounds. The gun 440 alpha on a medium tank is really nice. Gun depression kind of lets it down, I suppose, at 5 degrees, so it's a little bit painful at points. 0.35 accuracy isn't the worst. 2.7 second aim time is pretty awful for a medium tank, but you can get that down with some of the perks. Gun, really, really nice. I think that you'll have a decent time if you decide to get this. I think the tech tree line leading up to it, however, is kind of very painful. The tier 8 is awful, the T34-2, the T34-1 is awful, the Type 58's nice, The WZ-120, I think it's fairly okay, but you probably, if you're wanting to go for the medium tank, I would recommend going the light tank route until you get to tier 8 and then swap over to the WZ-120 once you've played some more in the WZ-132. That's what I'm going to do. I wouldn't really recommend playing the actual traditional Chinese mediums up to the 121. Yeah, definitely go the way I've gone. That's kind of the best way to go. And of course, you can get 2 tier 10s out of it rather than just 1 and then having to grind the extra tank line to get it. Of course, you can always go back and play these if you really want to, but to be honest, I wouldn't really want to go back and play them. Right. Moving on, Japan. There's a few tanks that I guess I'd avoid, and that is really the STB1 line. It gets that automatic siege mode. Don't know why I said automatic, weird there. But yeah, it gets the automatic siege mode. It has this kind of, it's pretty awful. Now the armor model doesn't really work. It doesn't have the best DPM anymore like it used to, I don't believe anyway. You get this weird kind of gun depression. Yes, you can get 14 degrees, but it's kind of a little bit awkward. Turret armor often leads to you not being able to actually use it properly because it takes so long to actually aim after the siege mode has been activated to get the 14 degrees of gun depression that often many people will be fully aimed and so can hit the kind of weaker part of the turret and pen anyway. So that kind of negates the whole impact of it. The standard ammo is fairly nice, 1478 max speed, which means it's APCR, and so you're going to be able to hit consistently. I think the tank is okay, not particularly the worst one in the game, but it's definitely not one of the ones you probably want to be going towards. Yeah, I don't think that that's kind of the area that I'd be looking at. STA1 is actually pretty fun, same with the Chi-Ri. Cheeto, oh god, awful. And the Type 61 I don't think is particularly amazing, but it's like a STA1 but upper tier and probably not as powerful tier for tier. And then the STB1 just, yeah, as we've talked about, is just not that competitive. Type 5 heavy line, really fairly decent now with the upgrades. They actually have fairly good frontal armor. They are slow, so that's kind of the weak point of them, is that they are slow. You do get the derp guns as well, and the option to choose 2 different guns on the tier 9 and the tier 10, which can do like 1400 damage or 1350 or whatever it is now. Yeah, decent tanks now. Don't think that they're particularly the ones that I'm that interested in, just because they're so slow and sometimes you can't impact the game at the beginning, so you end up actually losing just because you couldn't get there fast enough to be able to support your team as and when they needed, as opposed to something like a faster heavy tank like a Chieftain or something like that. Anyway, moving on, Czechoslovakia, there's not really much to talk about. The whole tank line is pretty much really good. The only tank that is pretty bad is the tier 8, the TVP VTU, which you probably, if you ever spend any converted XP into free XP and you want to skip a tank, this is probably the one you want to skip. It's just pretty awful. It's kind of like a tier 7 at tier 8 with a horrifically inaccurate gun if you want any sort of alpha damage, or you can just have a pretty inaccurate standard 220 alpha damage gun. It's just not the one that I'd go for. The rest of the line is really nice. Tier 6 pretty overpowered, tier 7 really nice tank, underrated I think, and then the tier 9 probably the best tier for tier out of the whole bunch, and the TVP T5051, well, you know how that is when I've done some of the videos on it if you've ever watched those. Just a fantastic tier 10 auto-loading medium tank with that kind of 4-shot burst of 320. Yeah, really fun one. As opposed to the next one, you have the Swedish line. We've got the Kranvan, the UDES, and the STRV 103B. Which is the worst one that you want to probably avoid first? Well, I'd say it's actually the Swedish TDs. I just don't think that they're that competitive. They are getting some buffs with the next update in World of Tanks as of the recording of this video, so if you're watching it in the future, they probably already have been buffed, so you'll be able to actually play them in a better degree of competitiveness than we currently have. Of course, they are actually really stealthy, so you can use the camo perks and the concealment to be able to remain undetected, so that's the benefit. But when you really think about it, how often can you use the camo? What maps actually feature camo? Well, it's things like Prokhorovka, you're looking at Malinovka, Muravanka, some of those maps, they're the ones that use camo, but with this, you're probably never going to actually be able to use it consistently, and so yeah, you get that real big problem with having consistent games in a TD like this. Armor model works very nicely if you are kind of using that gun depression and you are in siege mode. It becomes really, really nice. You can have decent gun depression, but when you compare it to, yet again, things like the 268 version 4 and some of the other tank destroyers, you're not going to be able to be competitive. UDES 1516, really good, and the Kranvan is also really, really good. The next tech tree is the Polish lines. We're going to have a look at those. I don't think there's really any awful tanks. The CS63, pretty decent, and the 60TP, really fairly decent, so I don't think we really need to go over them. Of course, the CS63 being the fastest medium tank that you can get in the game, at least a high tier that kind of is featured around that. And you don't actually have to incorporate the speed boost mechanics into the tank itself to make it kind of really, really fast. Just a kind of fairly decent tank overall. 60TP, really kind of nice heavy that has 750 alpha, decent penetration, fairly decent armor. Yeah, I think that there's not really much to be said. I don't think that any of them are particularly a bad choice to go towards. I think you'll probably have a little bit of pain going through the medium tanks on the Polish line between tiers 7 and 8. I think the Boogie is really nice, but other than that, nothing particularly awful. Some of the low tier heavies are not particularly that fun to play, but then again, there's not that many low tier heavies that are actually really fun to play. Moving on, Italian tanks, we have two. The Rinoceronte and the Progetto 65. There is no contest here. The Progetto 65 is the tank to go for first. Definitely don't go for the Rinoceronte first. It's got such bad DPM that it kind of just makes it irrelevant. Yes, it could be a good tank if it actually had competitive DPM, but it just doesn't, and it just becomes a tank that I would really put in the backlog of tanks to be able to actually get at tier 10, hence why I didn't actually grind towards it that quickly, and I'm so much further in the Progetto 65 line. I just wouldn't really go towards the Rinoceronte at all. So there we go. Moving on, mercenary tanks, we have the tier 10s to kind of focus on. You probably want the machine, you want the chisel, and the tusk is kind of the last one to get in terms of the contracts whenever they do decide to come out, but it's kind of one of those things that we should probably talk about because, if they're in the game, they'll be in the game at some point, and if you're watching this video in the future trying to find out whether or not the mercenary tank that you're going for is good, then yeah, the machine, the chisel, and the tusk, all good options. Just depends on which kind of meta or playstyle you want to play with. The chisel having much better armor than some of the M48 patterns, and the machine just having that disgusting autoloader that was the unnerfed TVP gun, and the tusk having that huge alpha damage gun that is just derp. So of course, if you do like the T49 with the derp or the Sheridan with the derp, then yeah, you're basically playing the tusk. Sharpshooter and hard case, definitely go for the hard case because its armor is just broken if you sit side on. It doesn't even make sense. Then we have the sharpshooter, pretty decent. Tier 8 cruncher, probably avoid. Jammer and the ramrod, probably avoid. Big top, that's pretty awful. Slapjack, just a T29 but upgraded. Then we have the reach, which is broken. The spyglass as an autoloader at tier 6, that's disgusting. Stinger, it's alright, it's good. Plaguebringer, probably not the one you want to go for. Then we have at tier 5 the Longbon. It's a derp gun on an 82, funny, but probably not that competitive. The Stubbs, yeah, meh. Smoothman, not that particularly great. Centrifuge, not particularly great. Deadbolt, probably not very good. And the Bulwark, with that stupidly fast-firing gun, you probably enjoy it, but it's tier 5, and I don't think I'll go into the tier 4 ones because there's a lot of overpowered ones that I don't really want to kind of show anyone or push it for anyone to actually play. As far as the tier 10 premiums that you can actually purchase, yes, there are quite a few. We'll be looking at, or we'll actually have to do it in the filter system. M60, probably avoid. T95 E6, probably avoid. M48, avoid. T95 FV4201, I really like this tank, same with the Valor. They are the same tank, but just a skinned version is the Valor. The WZ Quillin, really good one. Probably avoid the 121B and all of these tanks. If you're going to purchase them with free XP, don't do that. Or money themselves. Andre the Giant is pretty decent. VK7201K is, I think, an upgraded version of the actual Tech Tree Panzer 7. So the weak point isn't as bad, but it's probably still not that great. The Object 907, is probably an avoid one. T22 medium, it's not particularly that overpowered, and so I'd probably avoid it. Object 260, really, really good. Same with the Object 279E, competitive and the most broken probably out of them all. The Object 268 version 5, which we've done a few videos on, so if you want to check that out, you can do. Other than that, and that is literally all of the tier 10s and the Tech Tree lines that you can kind of go for within World of Tanks console. Of course, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you disagree? I'm not going to get butthurt if you actually disagree with anything or anything like that. So just get that discussion going. Hopefully you did enjoy this video, and I've got plenty more of these top 5 and the best tanks and stuff like that on the playlist that is on screen right now. So check that out. And if you want to check out part 1, and you haven't already, then that will be on screen too. Other than that, thanks very much for watching, and I hope that you'll join me in the next video. Goodbye.